On October 1, 2022, Kanjuruhan Stadium, a symbol of pride for Malang City football fans, suddenly turned into a morgue for hundreds of people. 7. A heartbreaking tragedy unfolded at the home of the Arema club. A football match that should have been a public entertainment event ended in mass death. Not only in Indonesia, but the entire world was shaken by this tragedy. Over the next few minutes, we will delve into the true story behind the Kanjuruhan tragedy, which claimed hundreds of lives in such a short time. How could the shouts and chants in the stands turn into cries and screams that will never be forgotten? Around 40,000 Arema supporters, known as Aremania, filled Kanjuruhan Stadium on Saturday night, October 1, 2022. Aremania have always loyally supported their beloved club in every match. But that night was different. All Aremania felt as if they had been summoned to the stadium because the opponent was Persebaya Surabaya, a fellow East Java team that had been their arch rivals for years. Arema versus Persebaya wasn't just a football match, but a long-standing rivalry with pride at stake. Since the afternoon, a sea of blue, the signature color of Aremania, had been visible throughout Kanjuruhan Stadium. The match wasn't scheduled to begin until the evening. According to several spectators, that afternoon was indeed different from usual. The journey to Kanjuruhan Stadium was fraught with struggle. Traffic jams occurred at several points. Travelers spent up to 2 hours compared to the usual 40 minutes due to the Aremania-filled streets. Likewise, once they arrived at the stadium, they had to queue for hours just to enter the stands. The match kicked off around 8 p.m. As usual, Arema versus Persebaya matches are always heated. Especially that night, goals were pouring in. Both Arema and Persebaya scored double goals in the first half. Being soft. Tensions began to spread to the stands. During halftime, a commotion broke out in stand 13. Several people were seen chasing and fighting each other. They were then apprehended by security personnel. It's unclear what sparked the fight, but the incident wasn't serious. The match continued into the second half. Second half scored. With Arema trailing, the atmosphere in the stands grew increasingly heated. According to testimony from a spectator reported by the BBC, several Aremania members began throwing objects onto the pitch. They were also heard using abusive language. However, the match continued until the referee finally blew the final whistle in the 90th minute. Arema conceded defeat to Persebaya on their home turf in front of tens of thousands of supporters. After the match, several Arema players were seen approaching the stands. With their heads bowed, they apologized to Aremania. For about 15 minutes, the Arema players remained on the pitch. Meanwhile, the Persebaya players immediately ran to the dressing room under tight security. And suddenly, amidst the still heated situation, a spectator, followed by 3 others, ran onto the pitch. They were from stands 9 and 10. Then approached the Arema player. He was seen pointing fingers as if venting his frustration. The Arema player facing him was seen trying to calm him down by embracing the spectator. But this was the beginning of the terrible disaster. According to a spectator's testimony, the police then approached the spectator who had entered the field and took repressive action. The police pulled the spectator's shirt and then began beating him. He reportedly fell to the ground after being hit. 3 of his friends behind him tried to help, but they ended up suffering the same fate, beaten with batons until they fell. At that time, one of the spectators who was beaten lay sprawled on the grass of the field. Meanwhile, the other 3 fought back but eventually fled. And of course, what happened on the field at that time was witnessed by tens of thousands of spectators who were still standing in the stands in the heated atmosphere.
Right.
Like a fire doused with gasoline, an explosion of anger engulfed the stands. Hundreds of spectators began climbing the fence and entering the field area. They chased the police officer who had carried out the beating. Other police officers on guard did not remain silent. A chase, fist fight, and throwing of blows between the police force and hundreds of spectators was unavoidable. The Kanjuruhan Stadium field area turned into a mass fight. Several spectators lay motionless after being hit by police batons, their heads oozing fresh red fluid. Other spectators who tried to help experienced the same experience. There were also police officers who appeared helpless as they were surrounded and beaten by dozens of spectators. In the chaotic situation, several police officers began deploying sniffer dogs to push back the spectators. However, the situation was never under control. Hundreds of spectators from the stands continued to enter the field area and chase the police. Until finally, the sound of explosions was heard in several places, followed by thick white smoke. This smoke was the beginning of a tragic incident that claimed hundreds of lives that night, as the stand suddenly turned into a very terrifying place. After the very brutal mass fight on the field could not be stopped, the police finally had to take one action that was actually very fatal, releasing tear gas into the crowd of spectators. The first tear gas was fired into stand 12 from a distance. The stand area appeared to have turned into a sea of white clouds. The smoke was so thick that the spectators in the stands could not be seen. Then tear gas was also fired into stands 10, 11, and 14. The horrific situation occurred in stand 14, which was mostly filled with children and women, where they began to scream and cry because of the stinging in their eyes and difficulty breathing. Some people began to fall unconscious. Hundreds of spectators in the stands attempted to exit to escape the effects of the tear gas. However, as they moved together, a stampede ensued, leading to a crushing death. Some were crushed and eventually lost their lives. Others suffered an even more tragic fate, being trampled around the stairwell. Several women began screaming, searching for their children who had been separated from the crowd. Their cries then turned into mournful cries when they saw the children they were searching for lying dead amidst the sea of people. The exit door to the stands was locked, trapping the crowd. They attempted to break down the metal door, but to no avail. Hundreds of spectators then poured in from the tribune area, trapping those in front of the door. Lacking oxygen, they collapsed and were trampled. That night, Gate 13 of the Kanjuruhan Stadium became a mass grave. Dozens of people, mostly children, lay lifeless suddenly. Those who were still conscious could only cry, trapped in the crush. They could only resign themselves to death. Elsewhere, around the stadium's prayer room, the situation was no less dire. Dozens of people lay in a tragic state. Most suffered head injuries of unknown cause. There was also a chilling testimony from one of Arema's foreign players, Kamara. According to Kamara, after the chaos broke out, they were immediately escorted by officers to the dressing room. However, from the dressing room, they could clearly hear the commotion on the field. Players also heard the booming sound of tear gas being fired. Moments later, Kamara saw dozens of people being taken to the dressing room in critical condition. They were suspected of having run out of oxygen due to being trapped in the stands filled with tear gas. Kamara could also clearly hear the screams that made the situation that night very tense. The Arema players in the dressing room were unable to move for 4 hours. After the situation began to be calm, the Arema players were escorted out of the stadium area under tight police guard. It was then that Kamara saw a sight he would never forget. Right in front of the Arema dressing room, dozens of lifeless bodies were laid out in a row. On his way out of the stadium, Kamara saw hundreds of shoes, clothes, and a fresh red liquid stuck to the floor. While it sounds horrific, Kamara's testimony was only a small part of the many, far more horrific facts that came to light a few days later, which even made the Kanjuruhan Tragedi, a sensational news story abroad Makiad. After the riots ended, the lobby and several areas inside Kanjuruhan Stadium were used as an emergency evacuation post. At this moment, there was once again gripping testimony from several volunteers who carried out the evacuation. They said that because of the large number, several lifeless bodies lay unclothed when they were evacuated to Tea Husada Hospital in Malang Regency, Anna. Even as the middle of the night approached, rain suddenly poured down. The lifeless bodies were left outside, exposed to the drizzle. Several victims who remained in the stadium in critical condition were rushed to the hospital by ambulance and army trucks. The situation that night was truly chaotic. Many critically ill victims later lost their lives on the way or while receiving treatment at the hospital. 5 days later, the police announced the death toll from the Kanjuruhan tragedy at 131. However, Aremania denied this figure. They claimed the number of victims reached at 200 because several spectators who lost their lives were taken directly to funeral homes without being registered at the hospital. On October 24, the police again updated the death toll. It was stated that the 135 people lost their lives in the Kanjuruhan tragedy. Tragically, most of the victims were minors ranging in age from 3 to 17. 42 of the victims were women. Based on this number of victims, the Kanjuruhan tragedy became the second deadliest football tragedy in history. Following the 1964 National Stadium disaster in Peru, which claimed 328 lives, the government then formed a joint fact-finding team to determine what really happened behind the Kanjuruhan tragedy and who should be held responsible. AFB-A5. The fact-finding team then made several important findings that sounded odd and should not have happened, namely the number of spectators exceeding the stadium's capacity. According to the head of the fact-finding team at the time, Mafad MD, the Kanjuruhan Stadium's capacity was only Rp 38,000. However, on the night of the tragedy, tickets were allegedly sold for Rp 2,000. This led to a massive stampede in the stands. Furthermore, the fact-finding team also highlighted the violence perpetrated by officers on the field, which sparked anger among spectators in the stands. Most shockingly, the fact-finding team discovered the mobilization of troops carrying tear gas midway through the second half. However, there was no threat or potential for security disruption by Jin. Debate also raged over the number of tear gas canisters fired by officers. The National Police claimed only 11 canisters were fired. However, the Washington Post reported shocking figures indicating that officers fired 40 canisters in just 10 minutes. Furthermore, there was debate over the cause of the victims' deaths. Based on autopsies conducted by an independent team from the Indonesian Forensic Medical Association, no tear gas residue was found in the victims' bodies, and the majority of their deaths were due to broken ribs and chest bones suspected to have been caused by being trampled and crushed. However, the victims' families testified that those who died were found with blackened faces, foam coming from the mouth, and urine leaking. Furthermore, the authorities also claimed that the violence on the ground was an act of self-defense. However, this was also denied by Aremania, who claimed that the authorities had beaten them first, as seen in several videos that went viral on social media. All the odd findings by the fact-finding team, along with the differing versions from the authorities and the victims' families, never resulted in a definitive explanation of who was right and who was wrong, who was telling the truth and who was lying. Aremania and the victims' families demanded a transparent justice process. The National Police later announced the 6 suspects deemed responsible for the Kanjuruhan tragedy, Dofi. They underwent a trial that again drew scrutiny due to several irregularities. One of the most shocking incidents at the time was the discovery of tear gas canisters in the stands, indicating that officers fired tear gas directly at the crowd. However, the public prosecutor stated that wind was a more crucial factor in the Kanjuruhan tragedy. Of the 6 suspects, 1 was acquitted. The others were sentenced to various terms ranging from 1 to 2.5 years in prison. 2 suspects were even acquitted, but their sentences were overturned by the Supreme Court. The Kanjuruhan tragedy briefly put Indonesian football on the verge of severe sanctions. However, thanks to government lobbying, FIFA did not impose any sanctions at all. Instead, it invited the PSSI, the governing body of Indonesian football, to collaborate to prevent a similar tragedy from happening again. Whatever the case, the Kanjuruhan tragedy remains a red mark that can never be erased from the history of Indonesian football. Jaka. Forget hundreds of lives. Even one lost life is too precious to be exchanged for a football match.